The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent, including Olas Media.
Olas Media. Olas Media presents Cannabis Enlightened, produced in San Diego, California. Now here's your host, Dr. Leroy Brady.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another stimulating episode of Cannabis Enlightened. I am your host, Dr. Leroy, and today we have someone who has seen perhaps many sides of cannabis as we enlighten ourselves with the knowledge of cannabis and what's going on in the cannabis space. He is a fascinating guest, and I can't wait to talk to Mr. Dustin Moore, founder of Embark. And in just a minute, we will be hearing from him.
Stay with us. We'll be back with more Dr. Leroy after this quick break. You're listening to Cannabis Enlightened on the Olas Media Podcast Network.
Okay, we are back with Dustin Moore, who is the founder of Embark. And many of you are saying to yourself, or maybe you know already, we may have a lot of fans out there, Dustin, who already know what Embark is all about. But Dustin, would you come in, introduce yourself, and give us a little background about in terms of who you are and what you're all about?
Well, first, Dr. Leroy, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm a huge fan. I've been an avid listener. So first, thank you for having me. So I am the founder of Embark. We are a retail platform in California, and we operate a number of dispensaries throughout the state. So, I did not come into this business, really kind of from a traditional angle, I guess. I really started from a public policy perspective. I was the day-to-day campaign manager for Proposition 64, and I worked really in politics leading up into my entry into the space.
So Proposition 64, although most of our listening audience knows about Prop 64, can you give us a brief background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, starting in 1996, we legalized medical use cannabis in California, and up until 2016, there really weren't any regulations in place. So starting in about 2014, the legislature really started to work on putting a regulatory package in place for cannabis. The political will wasn't there, so they really wanted to go to the voters. That drafting process started in 2014 to create a comprehensive piece of legislation that would govern adult use cannabis in California. And I was just so happened to be fortunate enough to be tapped to help with the drafting and the management of that campaign.
So for the people that are listening, they can know that as they are listening to you, you were part of the team or the person perhaps who wrote Prop 64 that brought legalization to cannabis here in California.
So Rich Matich was the lead drafter, and he's a phenomenal attorney. He's now at the FPPC, but I worked very closely with Rich. We worked with over 550 stakeholders to put in place this framework. Often ballot initiatives, are deals cut between somebody from the business community and from the labor community, and they shake hands and they ride off into the sunset, and that is the measure. But cannabis was a lot different. You had folks from basically every walk of life and every discipline that provided some sort of input in this document, and it was kind of a Herculean task to wrangle all of it.
And this task was not done just because you were there or because you wanted to make a whole bunch of money, as some people think that there is in cannabis. I think you had another reason for involving yourself in cannabis. What was that?
Yeah, cannabis is deeply personal to me, and it's a story that prior to me going into the operational side of this business that I didn't share with too many. When I was 7, my father had a number of brain aneurysms, clots that all basically erupted at the same time. He went through an experimental surgery. He was pronounced dead on the table for about 5 minutes before they were able to resuscitate him. And miraculously, he made it out of the other side, relatively similar to the way that he went in, with the one exception that he had significant seizures. This was before 1996. And medical cannabis was not even legal at the time. So, as far as options went, there really wasn't a lot of education around cannabis, but he did have a very progressive doctor that suggested he may want to try cannabis, because there was some interesting research coming out of San Francisco and a number of cannabis clubs where that was working. So,
Right.
my dad actually, was a victim of the failed war on drugs and was actually cited for cannabis possession, and his seizures subsided, and he realized there were other benefits, from the plant. And, from a very early age, I saw cannabis as a medicine. So I was really fortunate to have been, exposed to cannabis through that lens.
So let me back up for just a minute. Everything you've said is just fascinating. Your dad was involved in your term, the failed war on drugs, which I happen to agree with. How did that happen? What part did he play in that?
He got arrested for purchasing cannabis on the street, and it wasn't even good cannabis. It was it was cannabis besieged, because this was the early '90s, and Sensimilla was not really present in California yet. You were kind of Brian Brickweed, and that largely smelled like diesel from the tank that it came in. So he was arrested, and it was a bit traumatic. I mean, thankfully, Child Protective Services didn't get involved, but so many families prior to the legalization of adult use cannabis in California were broken up because of the need for somebody to medicate. And, fortunately that did not happen to me. Fortunately he did not serve a long-term sentence, but, it was still something that he was criminalized for using medicine. And from that moment on, it really became an issue of right and wrong in my mind. And, that's something that has stuck with me.
So he was actually arrested and convicted and did time for possession of cannabis.
He got it. He didn't actually he was arrested. He did not do any significant time. He's fortunate in the sense that given his background, he wasn't policed in the way that others were. And, so fortunately that was his outcome. But for so many, he, are not as fortunate as he was.
So when he purchased the cannabis, was he suffering from the seizures at that time?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I don't know, so I'm just asking you, it got progressively worse the older he got.
Was it because of the cannabis or not? But he still kept cannabis as a ritual, as part of his life, given some of the other ailments that came from the surgery. And I think just generally he realized it was part of his daily, regimen.
Now, was this something that you knew as you were growing up and you kept it in your mind, and this stuck with you as you got to the point where you were involved in cannabis politics, cannabis writing of Prop 64? Is that something that stayed with you?
Absolutely. My dad and I went together. I got my medical card at the OCBC in Oakland. The moment I turned 18, it was almost like a badge of honor to have arrived at that point post medical legalization. But cannabis policy. I've always been really passionate about politics. Mm-hmm. And politics and policy are fundamentally different things, right? Politics are the way that you achieve policy. And I just, was very, very passionate about policy, but also the politics that would arrive at a political outcome where this policy could survive.
Do you feel like cannabis is caught up in the politics of our society right now?
Absolutely. But it's a fundamental shift from where it was, when my dad first started consuming cannabis. Now it's used to galvanize, voter turnout. I was at the Clio Awards this last weekend, and, the Cannabis Voter Project was featured for having mobilized, as a bipartisan issue. I mean, you have folks like Seth Rogen now in national campaigns that are using cannabis to turn out the vote, which is just, it's inspiring to me that that's where we've, how far we've come. We have a long way to go, let's be clear, but
right,
making progress.
Now, let's move it. So your dad is doing well now?
Yes.
Okay.
I've been privileged to be put in front of so many different patient communities. And, as an example, just a few weekends ago, we held a Weed for Warriors event at our Fresno dispensary, and the turnout was incredible. And not just for the cannabis, but for the community. We have other veterans, that are our employees who have told us that, hey, this is the first time we felt like we've had a family since we left service. It's just, this plant is magical, and it has the ability to unify communities in such a positive way.
And not because of the THC that's in it. I know that most people that I come across, and I tell them what I do. I'm a podcast host for Cannabis Enlightened, the first thing that comes to their mind is the THC and the getting high. Then I have to quickly change and say, well, there's CBD, there's CBN, there's a lot of cannabinoids that are in cannabis that can help. Do you come across those kind of individuals?
Yeah, the learning curve is steep. The endocannabinoid system is so complex, and what cannabinoid works for you may not work for me. And, it's so important that people understand that this is not just about getting high. It's so much more complex than that. And I think there's so many different cannabinoids like, CBN, non-psychoactive for sleep. I mean, we're finally at a place where we're getting to do research now. I mean, I'm very proud of Prop 64 and the amount of money that was able to be deployed for research through the university systems in California. And I think we're just barely scratching the surface of what this plant can do.
Yeah, I cringe sometimes, and I guess you might too, when I hear a lot of my friends talk about buying cannabis at the gym or buying cannabis at 7-Eleven, a gas station on the way from here to there. And I say to them, do you really know what you're getting? Do you know what you're buying? And they'll say, well, not necessarily, but it says cannabis. I'm sure those are some of the kind of comments you've come across too in your travels through the cannabis industry.
Yeah, and I think it's the biggest challenge is the lack of access to legal cannabis, even in California, where 70% of the state still does not allow for legal sales. But where cannabis is becoming, legal, I think you're starting to see people, transition to licensed dispensaries because, look, we are as a society now try to eat close to the earth, work more cognizant as a society of what we put in our bodies, and to put cannabis in your body that has not gone through rigorous analytical lab testing is, just seems a little bit crazy to me. But I think largely people do that because they don't have access to legal cannabis. So now that that's changing, I sure hope that folks will change their consumption preferences because of it.
Yeah. I've had scientists on the program talk about the importance of making sure that your cannabis has been tested. And, for all intent and purposes, if it's tested, it's going to be sold at a legal dispensary. And for you to hear you say that is really big. I mean, you're not a scientist necessarily, but you're a founder of a cannabis industry store. So it's important to you that people get cannabis that is legal and tested, correct?
Absolutely. And I think we can look no further than a couple of years ago when we saw, pretty large epidemic of lung diseases attributed to the consumption of cannabis vaporizers. Well, if you looked at the areas where those cases were occurring, it was in parts of the state where cannabis was not legal yet. And there's a direct correlation between the illicit cannabis vape pens and those particular diagnoses. Unfortunately, they all got lumped together and it was said, well, cannabis vapes cause, lung disease. Well, in fact, it was the lack of analytical lab testing is what is, being found out objectively with science is showing that was simply because those were not tested in legal products. So there's a great example of why, using legal cannabis that's been tested is so critically important.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So now you talked about the importance of getting cannabis from that's licensed from a licensed store. Now, there seems to be another thing that's a drawback to a lot of people, and that's the cost of the legal cannabis. So what's your take on the price? I'll say this, what do you think is the cause of the high price of the cannabis?
I mean, we have state and local taxes that exceed, 40 to 50%. And if you look at the price of, cannabis you can buy at the gym, it's about 40 to 50% less than you could buy in the store. Well, the only difference there is the taxes. So, unfortunately, cannabis is often seen as a silver bullet to budget woes. And that's what creates the political will to pass legislation. But the direct effect of that is that you price cannabis so, at such a high rate that folks, especially looking now at inflation and gas prices, I understand why people, can't afford to buy cannabis. So really a lot of regulation and taxes that drive up the cost of what folks are buying from licensed shops.
Yeah. Yeah. So now you talked a few minutes ago about your dispensaries. Let's get into that. How many dispensaries do you have throughout California?
So we have 5 open today. Our 6th one opens in about a week and a half in my hometown of Sacramento. We're so proud, that's happening, and we have another 7 that are planned to open in the next couple of quarters. We're on track to get to about 22 stores by the first quarter of 2024. So we feel fortunate in this moment in time to be growing as a company. We're very excited about that.
Wow, that's a lot of stores throughout California. That's magnificent. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So now with that, the 5 that you have, how many employees do you carry?
So right now we are about a company of about 100 employees. That includes our corporate staff and our stores. We're pretty lean. So we're not we're pretty lean staff across the board, but we'll be at 200, by the second quarter of next year. So it's pretty meteoric growth for us right now. And it really, at the end of the day, we're nothing without our team. We built an incredible team, and we just feel fortunate to be, it's funny because, Lauren, my better half and our CEO, we always joke that we've become stewards of this idea that we had at a kitchen table during the pandemic has now turned into, something that has outgrown us. And we're so proud of that.
Right. So let me ask you this, Dustin. We have quite a few people that listen to the program that, as I said on the offset, want to get into the business, and for various reasons. I think they would benefit from hearing from you. What are some of the things that they might want to consider before getting into the business of cannabis?
It's going to be a lot harder than you think. It's going to take twice as long. It's going to cost twice as much. But if you can keep your head down, it's the most rewarding thing that you can do, I believe. For me personally, there's just something special about folks who self-select into this industry. The passion that people have to go to work every day. It's not like selling a cup of coffee or, whatever industry you may be in. It really does take a special type that there's typically we find that there's an element of people that self-select into this space that really do care about other people, because this plant has properties that, that I think they're naturally caring people. So this has been, I've been surrounded by some of the best people, but I would say that it's challenging, but worthwhile. And I think there's a lot of different ways to enter the industry. I think it's also, very important to spend some time learning about the industry before entering and understanding, different elements of the supply chain and, some of the non-plant touching sides of the business. And there's a lot of, companies, specifically in cannabis that don't get the same kind of traditional services, whether it be payroll or point of sale, et cetera, that in the cannabis industry, it's much harder to find, good providers. So it's not necessarily entering the industry doesn't necessarily mean that you're a licensed cannabis business, but you may be providing, a service to a cannabis business. I think that there's been over, 100,000 jobs created by this industry in California alone. And there's certainly going to be more created. And not all of those are created by licensed businesses.
Right. I love it. I love that you're bringing up that point. I'd stress to people that I talk to that, think about the gold rush days in California and the number of people that got rich, mining gold. But also on the other side, think about Levi Strauss, who decided to sell Levi's. Now, I don't know too many people that are mining gold right now, but
yeah.
I'm wearing a pair of Levi's right now, and I'm willing to bet there are a lot of folks throughout California and throughout the country, throughout the world that are wearing Levi's. So developing a business that supports a business like cannabis would be as beneficial as being in the cannabis industry.
I couldn't agree more. And it's also very translatable to other states. It's harder to take a licensed business and move into other states because of the rules, et cetera. But, as an example, I have a dear friend that started a point of sale company. It's going really well for them. And they're able to they can scale that at a much faster clip in other states because they're not tied to having to create significant infrastructure in every state in which they operate.
Right. Now, you talked about a person learning a little bit before learning some things, learning about cannabis. Not some things, but learning about cannabis. what would you suggest? What's a good way for a person to learn about cannabis before actually sticking their foot in it, getting their hands, in the cannabis industry?
Well, they need to enroll in one of your courses first. That would be the first step. I think that there are a lot of different resources that exist. I think some of them, there's a new program called Gangier, which is a gentleman named Max Simon from Greenflower that's creating, kind of trying to create standardized curriculums. I would also say, go into your local dispensary and, talk to your bud tender or your guide or your sales associate about, what challenges they may face. I mean, it's often, how do you solve a problem? I think that's, how do you create value? And I think you can talk to whether it's a grower or a dispensary owner, and ask them about their challenges, and then, think about your own skill set, and how you could apply yourself to help solve those problems. I think, cannabis is riddled with challenges, and, we need more capable people that are willing to step up and help solve problems.
You just brought up a word that I had typed for a question to pose to you early on. Challenges. What are the biggest challenges that you find in the industry as a founder?
Well,
deep breath.
That's a great question. I don't know how much time we have. I can spend. I think some of the biggest challenges are generally that cannabis still has a very big stigma around it. So whether you're dealing with your local municipality, your regulator, your banker, whoever it may be, there's a significant learning curve on the front end. So folks understand that this is just a business and that people are doing this for the right reason. So the stigma in and of itself creates the largest challenge. As a dispensary operator, I think we're on the tip of the spear breaking those stigmas because we're forward facing in communities. But I would say that that's probably, one of the biggest challenges is breaking through the stigma. We are in a retail business. So I think, you've got a lot of personalities as we build teams. So working through that is critical. Education. I just can't stress that enough, whether it be, again, municipalities, regulators, your employees, whatever it may be. We really see ourselves as facilitators of what we're doing as stewards of this industry. And, I think we just have to keep breaking down the barriers.
Wow. That is great advice. I appreciate that. And I hope the people listening to this particular episode of the podcast take this to heart from a founder of one of the more progressive, thinking forward cannabis industries here in California, Embark. Dustin, is there any parting words you'd like to leave with the listening audience in terms of the cannabis industry, why they should go in it, how they should go in it? What would be a thought that you would like them to have at the forefront of their mind?
I think that if you're listening in and you care about this industry, kudos to you, because we need people to continue to champion the efforts of normalizing this magical plant that has so many beneficial properties to our society. In a society that's as divided as we are today, we need a lot more cannabis in our lives. So please keep up what you're doing. Right.
Great. So now, if folks would like to get in touch with you to maybe follow up and say, hey, I'd like to talk to the man, how would they reach you?
Our website is goembark.com. So GOEMBARC.com. And I'm just Dustin at goembark.com. And I'd love to hear from anybody. At the end of the day, I love this industry because of the people. So I'd love to hear from your listeners. And yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dustin. Listen, it's been a pleasure, a delight, a thrill to talk to you today. You've been a fascinating guest, and I appreciate your time that you've given us. So thank you again very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have any comments or questions for me, please reach out to Dr. Leroy at cannabisenlightened.com. I'm your host, Dr. Leroy. Thanks for listening. And remember, knowledge is power.
Olas Media.